Hello and welcome. My name is Brad Damon. I am the founder, co-owner, and head strength coach of Elite Athlete Training Systems. I wanted to put together a series of presentations because I find I'm having the same conversations with athletes over and over with common things that come up in the athletic development field. And so I figured I could put together a series of presentations that will help everyone kind of get to a base level instead of having to start from scratch every single time we have a conversation about athletic development. So today's presentation, I want to talk about why we get injured. The first thing we need to establish in this presentation is that I am not a doctor, nor am I a medical practitioner. I am simply just a strength coach with 15 years of experience in the field. In the event that you're seeing a doctor or practitioner and they're giving advice that doesn't mesh with what I'm talking about in this presentation, definitely take their advice and not mine, as they are medically trained professionals. None of this should be considered medical advice. So obviously, pain and injury are multifactorial and very, very difficult, if not impossible, to narrow down to one specific reason why something hurts or why an athlete got injured. But there are a few kind of low-hanging fruit concepts that if we can understand these ideas, it becomes a lot clearer why we end up getting hurt when we play sports or even just kind of live life to the fullest. And I think the lowest hanging of those fruits in terms of the concepts would be the evolutionary mismatch. So for roughly 99% of human history, Homo sapiens survived as nomadic hunter-gatherers moving over chaotic, unpredictable terrain. Our joints, tendons, and connective tissue evolved to be robust, high-variance structures shaped by daily climbing, sprinting, lifting, and uneven foot strikes. Today, we live in a highly domesticated, flat world environment dominated by concrete, chairs, and heavily cushioned, restrictive footwear. A calorie used to be the most valuable resource on the planet, worth more than gold. Now a calorie costs fractions of a penny. This evolutionary mismatch happens because biological tissue adapts precisely to the forces placed upon it. If you do not expose a joint to its full range of motion, the nervous system physically decommissions that unused space. Modern life strips away our natural joint capacity, turning a highly adaptable athletic machine into a brittle, specialized structure. Injury occurs when a domesticated joint with low biological capacity is suddenly thrown onto a field and forced to handle chaotic, full-velocity athletic demands. Now we're going to touch on the formula for injury. An injury is not an event of bad luck or a random anomaly. It's a cold mathematical calculation where physical stress outpaces biological tolerance. On the screen, you can see the exact formula for injury. Let's start by defining the variables. So load or demand is the total amount of force applied to a specific tissue at any given moment. For example, the force of cutting on the turf, making a tackle, or cumulative volume over a game. Tissue capacity is the maximum amount of force that a specified biological structure, i.e. tendon, ligament, muscle, joint capsule, or bone, can absorb, tolerate, and dissipate without structural failure. Old school coaching and rehab focused almost entirely on trying to arbitrarily reduce the load or demand side of the equation, using tape, wearing heavy braces, cutting down playing time, or avoiding specific movements. In the reality of sport, you can't control the chaotic, high-velocity forces of competitive sport. Demand will always spike unpredictably on the field. Therefore, the only logical variable of performance we can manipulate to attempt to prevent structural failure, or at least mitigate the severity, is to systematically increase tissue capacity. Next, I want to move on to the best predictor of future injuries, that being previous injury. In sports medicine and performance, the number one statistical predictor of an injury is a previous injury to the exact same body part. It isn't bad luck, it's unmanaged biology. When a tissue is acutely damaged, like an inversion sprain, the body rushes to patch the wound by laying down collagen. However, this scar tissue is laid down haphazardly in a chaotic crisscrossed web rather than the neat parallel lines of healthy tissue. Because this patch job is mechanically disorganized, it is naturally more brittle, less elastic, and weaker. The structural integrity of that joint is fundamentally compromised, causing its baseline tissue capacity to drop significantly. The biggest trap in athletics is assuming that because the pain went away, the joint is healed. Pain is just a neurological alarm system. When the acute inflammation goes down, the alarm turns off, but the structural house is still built on a weak foundation. If an athlete returns to the field simply because it doesn't hurt anymore, they're exposing a joint with severely diminished capacity and chaotic tissue alignment to the exact same high velocity sport demand as before. Because the tissue capacity ceiling is now significantly lower, the athlete doesn't even need a massive trauma to hurt it again. A much smaller routine spike in load is now enough to trigger the exact same injury. To break this re-injury cycle, you cannot just rest or run in straight lines. We must intentionally and progressively load the specific tissues in the exact angles and outer ranges where the damage occurred. Under heavy, controlled tension, the body responds to the mechanical stress by physically remodeling that chaotic scar tissue, straightening it out, and thickening the connective structures to permanently restore the joint's capacity ceiling. As we touched on earlier, talking about the evolutionary mismatch, our hunter-gatherer ancestors survived on high variance, low specification movement. Their days consisted of walking miles on uneven dirt, climbing trees, crouching for hours, throwing rocks, and carrying awkward loads. No two steps, strides, or joint angles were ever identical. Because their movement was completely random and varied, mechanical stress was distributed evenly across the entire skeletal system. No single joint or tissue took the brunt of the daily load. Sport is the exact opposite of evolutionary variance. A sport is defined by artificial constraints, a specific set of rules, a fixed surface, and a highly repetitive skill set required to win. Sport demands low variance, high specification movement. A baseball pitcher throws at one exact angle thousands of times. A hockey player skates with their hips locked in external rotation on a flat sheet of ice all winter. A football player plants and cuts hard on identical, unforgiving synthetic turf. Because of these sport constraints, mechanical force is no longer distributed evenly. It's violently channeled into the exact same joints at the exact same angles over and over again. And it gets worse when you look at the modern athlete's life outside of sport. They spend 8+ hours a day sitting in a chair at school or work, walk exclusively on flat concrete in restrictive shoes, and then go to practice to perform 500 high-velocity specialized cuts. The hunter-gatherer biology expects a fully mobile, adaptable chassis. Instead, sport forces a restricted, domesticated chassis to repeatedly redline a few specific components. The demand on those specific joint angles exponentially outpaces their biological capacity, leading to the exact failure point we established earlier, that being when load or demand exceeds tissue capacity. The result is injury. Now, if we're going to talk about why we get injured, I think it's important, particularly for young athletes, to talk about the difference between hurt and injured. To build a resilient athlete, we have to completely change how they interpret physical feedback. Most athletes treat any form of pain as catastrophic structural damage, which completely derails their rehabilitation and training consistency. So what does it mean to be hurt? Being hurt is an experience of pain, which is a neurological threat signal generated by the brain. It acts like a smoke alarm. It tells you there might be a problem, but it doesn't mean the house is burning down. There's often zero actual tissue damage, tear, or structural defect present when you feel hurt. If a joint is structurally sound but sending a loud threat signal, we don't completely stop training. We modify variables such as tempo, range, or load to show the nervous system it's safe, systematically silencing the alarm. What does it mean to be injured? Being injured means there's objective biological pathology. This is actual structural failure, a fractured bone, a ruptured ligament, a torn muscle belly, or a detached tendon. The mechanical integrity of the structural component has physically failed because demand completely crushed capacity. So now that we've talked about why we get injured, and we've talked about the difference between hurt and injured, let's create a triage guide so that when injury occurs, you know what to do. So level 1, we're going to call emergency care. This is severe, unmistakable trauma. Often when athletes need to go to the hospital, they're going to know they need to go to the hospital. This is a bone sticking out, massive rapid swelling, an absolute inability to bear weight, or neurological numbness or tingling. All of this means a trip to the hospital ER. Now, important to know that the mandate in the ER is stability and survival. The ER doctor cares if you're going to live, die, or lose the limb. They do not care about your sporting career, your end range hip internal rotation, or your 40-yard dash time. If you aren't dying and the bone is in one piece, they will patch you up and send you home. Do not expect performance advice from a trauma ward. Level 2 is a medical diagnosis. Persistent pain that doesn't clear up after 24 to 48 hours, mystery joint locking, or anything requiring clear imaging like x-rays, MRIs, or CT scans. Notice who's in this column. It's not just your general practitioner. For musculoskeletal issues, an athlete is often far better served going straight to a competent physiotherapist or chiropractor for diagnostic clarity. If you take a complex sport movement injury to a standard family doctor, their default prescription most of the time is take Advil, stop training, and rest for 4 to 6 weeks. That is a medical disclaimer, not a plan. A great sports physio or chiropractor, however, understands the demands of sport. They'll pinpoint the exact pathology, tell you what is actually structurally damaged, and help clear you for targeted activity. Level 3 is performance restoration. This is where we at E.A.T.S can take the baton. Once Level 2 confirms there is no acute fracture, complete rupture, or surgical emergency, you can enter the restoration phase. Medicine stops at not broken. If a practitioner tells you you're healed just because the bone knitted back together or the swelling went down, they've only gotten you back to zero. Being not broken does not mean you're ready to absorb 5 times your body weight, cutting at full speed on the field. Level 3 is about building structural and functional capacity. This is where we eliminate the neurological compensations the athlete picked up while limping around, restore full range of motion, and progressively overload the tissue. Our goal in Level 3 isn't just to get you back to normal. Normal is what got you broken in the first place. The goal is to transition you from not broken to dangerous and competent, widening your capacity ceiling so that when you step back on the field, your capacity is higher than the day you left it. So next I want to touch on the biggest pet peeve I have in the strength and conditioning industry, the athlete development industry, and that is the lie of injury prevention that's used to sell memberships and programs and exercises. The claim that a coach, program, or exercise can prevent injury is the biggest scam in the S&C industry, particularly in youth sports. It plays on the parents' fear of their kids being injured. Unfortunately, injury is the reality of sport and life lived to its fullest. The cost of high performance is your health. Remember the formula: load or demand exceeding tissue capacity equals injury. You can't avoid getting hurt, but you can try to mitigate the severity of the injury. This is accomplished through a structured training regimen that takes into account the common injuries associated with the particular sport, as well as the current state of trainability of the athlete, what we call point A, and the required state of trainability of the athlete, what we call point B. Now let's shift to what to do post-injury, specifically immediately after the injury occurs, and I want to start with the RICE protocol that everyone's familiar with. So Dr. Gabe Merkin is an American sports medicine physician, board certified in pediatrics, allergy, immunology, and sports medicine. He was a pioneer in the fitness boom of the 1970s and 80s, co-authoring the best-selling book, The Sports Medicine Book, in 1978. In that 1978 book, Dr. Merkin coined the acronym RICE, Rest, Ice, Compression, Elevation. It instantly became the global standard of care for athletic trainers, doctors, and coaches dealing with acute, soft tissue injuries like sprains and strains. This protocol was based on the assumption that inflammation and swelling were inherently bad things that needed to be aggressively suppressed to speed up recovery. In 2014, 36 years after creating the protocol, Dr. Merkin published an article on his website titled "Why Ice Delays Recovery," officially recanting his original recommendations. He explicitly wrote, "Coaches have used my RICE guideline for decades, but now it appears that both ice and complete rest may delay healing instead of helping." Dr. Merkin changed his stance after analyzing decades of shifting peer-reviewed data. The breakthrough research came from a landmark study published in the American Journal of Sports Medicine in 2013, alongside decades of clinical physiology work from researchers like Gary Reinol, which proved that icing a joint actively delayed the tissue repair process. Let's tackle the RICE protocol one recommendation at a time, starting with rest. When an orthopedic injury occurs, the traditional instinct is to freeze, brace, and completely rest it. We think sitting still protects the joint. In reality, unless you're dealing with a brain injury, complete rest is a death sentence for tissue quality. Your body does not heal in stagnation, it heals through movement. Let's establish the boundary immediately. There is one absolute exception to the movement rule, and that is a concussion. A concussion is a neurological metabolic crisis, not an orthopedic one. The brain requires complete physical and cognitive rest early on to restore its energy balance. But everything from the neck down, muscles, tendons, ligaments, joints, they require a completely different biological playbook. The lymphatic system is the system in the body responsible for the inflammatory response and swelling that happens at an injured area. Let's take a quick look at the anatomy of the lymphatic system, particularly as compared to the cardiovascular system. Your cardiovascular system has a heart. It's an active, autonomous pump that pushes blood to your extremities 24/7, whether you move or not. The lymphatic system is solely responsible for clearing away all cellular debris, fluid accumulation, and swelling from an injury site, and has no heart or pump. It is a completely passive system. It's a series of one-way valves. The only way fluid moves up and out of the limb is through physical compression of surrounding muscles. Every single time a muscle contracts, it physically expands and squeezes the adjacent lymphatic vessels. That squeeze forces the waste fluid past a one-way valve, pumping it out of the joint and back towards central circulation to be cleared. When you put an athlete on the couch to rest a sprained ankle, you aren't protecting it, you're shutting off the drainage engine. Without muscle contraction, the fluid stews in the joint space. It stagnates, builds pressure, increases pain, and glues the joint tissues together, creating toxic junk that delays recovery. Another important consideration when thinking about rest versus movement is that movement aids in mechanotransduction. It doesn't just clear waste, it builds new structure. Connective tissue responds to a cellular process called mechanotransduction. This means that cells, like fibroblasts and tendon or ligament, physically sense mechanical tension and load. When you gently and progressively move a joint through a pain-free range of motion, that mechanical tension acts as a cellular signal. It tells the body exactly where and how to align the new collagen fibers. If you don't load it, the body doesn't know how to rebuild it, resulting in the exact chaotic, weak, patch job scar tissue we talked about previously. Next up in the RICE methodology is ice. If you get a soft tissue injury today on the field, the first thing people yell for is an ice pack and a roll of tape to wrap it tight so you can sit still. The RICE protocol, invented in 1978 by Dr. Merkin, has dominated sports medicine for nearly 4 decades. However, people like Gary Reinl, author of Iced, the Illusionary Treatment, have spent decades exposing the physiological damage caused by icing. When tissue is damaged, the body initiates an inflammatory response. This isn't a mistake. Inflammation is the biological engine of repair. The body rushes macrophages to the site to release IGF-1, insulin-like growth factor, which is required to remodel and heal the torn tissue. Ice causes severe vasoconstriction, narrowing of blood vessels. It shuts down the blood supply to the area and prevents macrophages from ever reaching the damaged tissue. Even worse, ice increases lymphatic permeability. The lymphatic system is a one-way drainage network that requires muscle contraction to pump fluid out. Ice paralyzes the local nerves and muscles, shutting down the pump and causing cellular waste to pour back into the space. There's an important distinction here, and that is the difference between inflammation and swelling. You must understand the difference between these two. Inflammation is the active healing mechanism, like the workers rebuilding the house. Swelling is the accumulation of fluid and industrial waste left behind on the job site. The goal is not to stop inflammation or the workers. The goal is to clear the swelling or the waste. Ice stops the workers and traps the waste. Next up in RICE is compression. We've established that movement is the pump that clears the wreckage, but if you want to optimize how fast a joint heals, you have to look at the fluid dynamics under the skin. Think of an injured joint like a high-performance workspace. To rebuild the structure, you need a highly efficient supply chain. We call this formula groceries in, garbage out. Let's start by defining the variables. The groceries. This is fresh, highly oxygenated, nutrient-dense arterial blood. It contains the raw materials, the building blocks, proteins, and healing factors that your body needs to physically reconstruct damaged tissue. The garbage, this is the stagnant, non-circulating fluid, cellular debris, and swelling that pools around the joint immediately after the trauma occurs. Arterial blood, or the groceries, is pushed down into the limb under high pressure by the heart. It has no problem getting to the injury site. However, if the local lymphatic drainage system is shut down or overwhelmed, the waste fluid, or the garbage, accumulates rapidly, building massive localized pressure. When the joint is completely engorged with garbage, it creates a biological traffic jam. The high internal pressure physically blocks fresh, nutrient-rich arterial blood from entering the tissue. If the trash hasn't been picked up from the job site in 3 weeks, you can't back the delivery truck in with fresh lumber. By letting an injury sit there and swell up like a balloon, you're literally starving the damaged tissue of the very groceries it needs to heal. This is where compression wraps like floss bands come into play. We don't just wrap it statically to freeze it, we use compression to alter the local pressure gradients. When you apply tight compression to an engorged joint, you manually increase the external pressure, physically forcing the stagnant fluid, the garbage, out of the interstitial space and pushing it up into the lymphatic channel so it can be cleared. The second you remove that compression wrap, the localized pressure drops to zero. This creates a powerful vacuum effect. Fresh, highly oxygenated, nutrient-dense blood, or the groceries, violently rush into the newly cleared space, completely saturating the hungry, damaged tissue. When we use compression, we're not using it to immobilize an athlete. We combine compression with our previous rule of movement. We wrap the joint to manually squeeze the garbage out, and then we immediately have the athlete move through their pain-free range of motion. We're using the mechanical muscle pump and external compression simultaneously to double the speed of the drainage network. We wrap it, pump it for a few minutes to evict the garbage, snap the wrap off, and flood it with groceries, and repeat. The final piece of the RICE methodology is elevation. We've established that active movement combined with compression is our standard operating procedure for flushing the joint. But you can't move 24 hours a day. When you're sleeping, watching film, or forced to be stationary, your body loses its mechanical muscle pump. This is where we recruit the oldest, most reliable force on Earth to do the heavy lifting for us, gravity. When an athlete is sitting on a chair or standing with a rolled ankle or swollen knee, the joint is positioned below the level of the heart. Because the lymphatic system is entirely passive, fluid has to fight an uphill battle against gravity to get back into central circulation. Hydrostatic pressure builds up in the lower extremity, creating that heavy, throbbing sensation every injured athlete knows. Leaving a damaged joint dangling below the heart while at rest is a direct guarantee that the garbage will settle and stagnate. Elevation can reverse this flow. Elevation is the strategic use of physics during downtime. By raising the injured limb above the level of the heart, you completely flip the pressure gradient. You turn a grueling uphill battle into a downhill slide. Gravity shifts from being the enemy to being the active pump. It naturally draws the interstitial waste fluid and stagnant swelling out of the joint capsule, guiding it back down the lymphatic pathways towards the thoracic duct where it can be filtered and excreted. Most athletes think elevation means propping their foot up on a coffee table while sitting on the couch. If your foot is on a table, but your hips are bent and your chest is upright, your ankle is still at or below the level of your heart, and the bent hip creates a literal kink in the drainage hose. To actually clear the deck, the athlete needs to lie flat on their back and prop the limb up using wedges or pillows so the joint is explicitly higher than the pump in their chest. We want a distinct, unobstructed downhill ramp. Elevation is our passive defensive strategy. It keeps the joint from backsliding into a swollen traffic jam when the athlete is in training. By keeping the trash moving out while at rest, we ensure that the moment the athlete stands up to execute their pain-free movement drills, the joint isn't engorged. It's primed and ready to receive fresh groceries. Now let's move on to what to do post-injury within the first few days. So if you went to the hospital for the injury, follow up with your general practitioner or a physio to make sure everything is still on track. If you didn't go to the hospital but pain persists, it's time to see a physio, a chiro, or some type of medical practitioner that can help you understand what's going on. It's important that you begin the rehab process as soon as possible. So, this means as soon as you're aware that the injury is not life threatening, let's start rehabbing. Next is what to do post injury within the first few weeks or even months. So, if the injury is serious enough to last for weeks to months, it's crucial to consider factors outside of the injury that can aid in recovery. Things like making sure you're getting enough sleep so your body can repair itself, making sure your nutrition is dialed in so your body has building blocks to work with. Do not stop training. If you've injured a leg or an arm, you can train the opposite leg or arm and have some carryover effect to the injured side. If you have a lower body injury, you can train upper body and vice versa. If you're so injured that you can barely move, we can still train things like breath work. So, again, outside of a concussion, we can train through almost anything. You can also try to improve or at least maintain your aerobic fitness, as this is the base of all fitness. And you can engage in the mental side of your sport, things like watching film, doing mental reps, etc. Next, let's look at something you could add to your training today that will assist in injury mitigation in terms of severity. Earlier, I said there was no such thing as magical exercises, and I still believe that. But the closest thing to a magical exercise we have is controlled articular rotations. CARs are active, maximal rotational movement of a specific joint through the absolute outer limits of its current workspace. It's not a passive stretch or a lazy warm-up circle. It's an intentional, high-tension, neuromuscularly controlled exploration of your joint anatomy. You're pushing right up against the borders of your joint's capacity under self-generated resistance. CARs have 4 functions or uses: range of motion maintenance, articular health and longevity, articular analysis and diagnosis, and rehabilitation. Let's look at them one by one, starting with range of motion maintenance, or defending your physical real estate. The body operates on a strict use it or lose it neurodevelopmental protocol. If you do not actively take a joint to its terminal end range of motion, your brain identifies that unused space as a liability, triggers a process called arthrokinematic inhibition, and literally mats it over with connective tissue. CARs require an athlete to generate internal tension or irradiation to fight through their current absolute boundaries. By actively visiting the outer limits of the joint daily, you're sending a loud biological signal to the nervous system. Keep this gate open. We own this real estate. It's how we actively prevent our athletes from becoming domesticated and restricted by the repetitive, narrow movement constraints of their sport. Next is articular health and longevity, the internal cellular pump. Hyaline cartilage, the protective material lining the ends of your bones inside a joint capsule, is completely avascular, meaning it has no direct blood supply, feeding it nutrients or hauling away cellular waste. Cartilage is like a dense sponge. The only way it receives nutrients and stays healthy is through a mechanical process called fluid diffusion. When you perform a high-tension CAR, you're creating a wave of localized pressure across the entire articular surface. You're manually squeezing cellular waste and inflammatory byproducts out of the cartilage, and as you pass through that range, fresh, nutrient-dense synovial fluid is sucked in. 3. Articular analysis or diagnosis, the daily hardware audit. You can't fix a compensation pattern if you don't know it exists. Most athletes don't realize their hip has lost internal rotation until they plant, cut, and violently tear an ACL because the knee had to twist to make up for a locked hip. Because CARs require strict capsular isolation, meaning you block the rest of the body from moving or cheating to assist the joint, they act as a daily hardware diagnostic tool. As an athlete completes their daily CARs circles, they're running an internal scan. They can instantly detect a closing side joint pinch, a new pocket of pain, or a sudden drop in range. It gives the coach and the athlete the exact diagnostic clarity needed to modify that day's loading parameters before a catastrophic structural failure occurs. 4. Rehabilitation, rebuilding from the ground up. When an athlete is recovering from an acute injury, the damaged joint is fundamentally compromised. It has dropped tissue capacity and a loud neurological alarm system called pain. We introduced CARs early in the rehab process as a highly controlled, scalable regression. By modifying the circle size, reducing the perimeter, or dropping the internal tension down to 10 to 20%, we can safely introduce mechanical stress to the healing tissue. This is light, pain-free rotational loading, stimulating mechanotransduction, telling the chaotic scar tissue to align linearly, while simultaneously desensitizing the brain's threat alarm. It is the absolute bridge that guides a joint from being structurally broken back to surviving high-velocity sport demands. That brings us to the end of the presentation on why we get injured. I want to thank you for your time and attention during this presentation. Hopefully you have some takeaways that you can think about and chew on. Hopefully some things you can bring up with your doctor, chiro, physio, or whatever practitioner you see next time you see them. And hopefully this makes the idea of being an injured athlete less intimidating and scary, as you realize it's a normal part of the process. If you have any questions or concerns, feel free to reach out. My email is brad@eatssg.com. That's brad@eatssg.com. Or you can DM the Instagram page or Facebook page, and eventually the message will get back to me. Thanks for your time. We'll see you in the next one.